When we had, towards the end of last week's session, when we were talking about self-directed and self-organised and the whole thing, we were running out of time, but that was the conversation we were having. It just sparked so many things in my mind, and I thought, I must go and look at this. I went away from the meeting afterwards, and I thought, I remembered the maturity model that I'd created from going from pedagogy to andragogy, and an article I'd written about pandragogy, about something about this is a mixture of both, because for me it described exactly the approach that I had with the children at school and also with the students at university. And there wasn't a discernible difference between working with 10 and 11-year-olds and working with 18, 25, 45-year-old people. The principles still seem to be the same, which is why I felt I wanted to put something together a long time ago. And then after our conversation, it made me start thinking about somewhere in here, there must be a connection with what is self-managed learning, what is self-organized learning, what is self-directed learning, what's self-regulated learning. And it's a conversation I feel I would love to have. My level is definitely at a practitioner level. What does self-organized learning look like? I'm trying to, rather than rely on theory to tell me, I'm trying to think practically and in terms of the way that we use words without thought about what they really mean, just in the context of vernacular language that's used every day. I needed 4 selves. It's that sort of basic at this stage. It's like which of the selves has a definition that people might agree on and can be, and people have a shared understanding of what that means. There are 2 that I'm aware of that have a theory with them, that have academic writing behind them. One, self-organized learning, from which the concept of learning conversations as a theoretical model came from in my reading. So self-organized learning has some behind it, but it's very much focused around 2 people who the book that they wrote about it. And in a similar way, Deci and Ryan came up with a self-determinant theory, which is probably a bit more widely understood, and it sort of leans towards pedagogy. And therefore, that's probably the theoretical, really strongly theoretical model. So I kind of put that one up at the top as the sort of the goal to be working towards. But I'm still not sure. I just think there could be a value in having the discussion about, so what if people are starting to be more aware of themselves as learners and they get better and better at it, is there a hierarchy of terminology that could be used to describe those stages that they go through? And if so, where do the words that are used very freely but without really a lot of thought about what do they actually mean, or does everybody have the same understanding of what that means? Probably the most important thing. How could we use the terminology, or how could we put forward a proposal about this is the terminology works if you think of it in terms of steps towards something. The conversation that we had last week has sparked my thinking, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And even though I was frustrated through limitations of time this week, I still had it all in my head and I needed to write it down. But you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, Sisko, by saying, I'm familiar with self-regulated. Where does that sit in this? Because I'm not familiar with the other terminology. And that is right at the center, I think, of this issue. People seem to be going in education, seem to just say, oh yes, self-directed learning, and they pretend that they know what it means, but they don't.
Yeah, or they genuinely think that they know, because our brain works in a way that we always have an idea of everything. Even if we hear the word for the first time, we already make some meaning. I think this is the like should be done in every subject when you start with your students with new concepts, to have this discussion what conceptions the students have of these concepts, so that you know what they need to unlearn if they have misconceptions. And then finally you would all be on the same page when you start using the concept.
I think a good place to start with this, I think the question of where does self-regulated learning fit into this is a great one to be thrown at for this. But I just before I forget, the model of the spiral, where we talked about revisiting things and learning, there is as much that has already been learned as there is still to learn potentially. And unless we go back and look at it again, then we don't see the new learning that's in it. And by taking people back to the things that they originally thought had a particular meaning to their concept, and get them to look at it again in the light of new information, then that's where the new learning comes. So I think it is important, the whole thing about taking people back and sometimes unlearning something so that you can learn even more than you learned before, if that makes sense. Okay, well, I think that the starting point for me would be the fact that there's a lot of use in the UK, certainly in the UK, about rethinking education, redefining education, and within that, there's a lot of terminology about self-directed, self-regulated, self-organized learning. And for some time, I've done battle with this, because I have to ask people, what exactly do you mean by that? Because as Sisko quite rightly said, I have either a concept of what that means, or I've never heard of that term used in that way. So actually, at the moment, I have no concept of it. So I need to know what you think of it in order for me to be able to develop my own understanding of it, and to see the extent to which I have a shared understanding. So the principle behind this is actually challenging the terminology that we use in education so we can understand it. And this is an example of it, what I refer to as the selves: self-managing, self-organizing, self-directing, self-regulating, self-determining, etc. And what does each one look like? I tend to understand things better if I can get an idea of, well, what would it, if I saw that, how would I recognize it? What might that look like? And what that reminded me of was some work that we did in the late 1990s and the early 2000s in the UK around personalizing learning. And Professor David Hargreaves from Cambridge University, he was very articulate about what personalizing learning looked like. And one of the things that he created in a series of books that he wrote about this, they were only thin books, but there were a series of books that he wrote about personalizing learning. And he suggested that he could describe or explain what personalizing learning looked like for somebody who had had the experience of their learning being personalized for them, and what characteristics they displayed. And he came up with this list of 6. Learners were much more engaged with their learning. His argument was that when learning has been effectively personalized, so it has more meaning to the individual, their level of engagement increases. They take greater responsibility for their learning. They become more independent over it, and they control over their learning, which I think is a lot of where the selves come in: self-directed, self-organized, for example. they become much more confident in themselves. They have a better understanding of themselves. Levels of cognition, metacognition are raised. This helps them to have more maturity in terms of their relationships with their staff and with their peers, and they can have much more informed and mature conversations about their own learning in a more open and respectful way, to the point that they actually want to co-construct. They don't rely on somebody constructing their learning for them. They actually want to be part of that. They want to join in with it. They want to put their own ideas forward. And that, for me, when I came across that, I thought, this is what we are trying to do with our own children in our school. And although this had been written for secondary schools, I felt that in a primary school, it was still appropriate. And therefore, rather than thinking about this in terms of adolescence, teenagers and adolescents becoming more mature as they went through school, I thought, well, why can't we have this as an aspiration for younger children? I had experience of children who were happy to take more responsibility for their learning, had quite high levels of metacognition, and could talk about themselves as learners and how they learn best. And that was really quite confident. So I said, I wondered what this would look like if we were to say, okay, so what does each of these characteristics look like when it first starts to appear? So I came up with this maturity model. The idea being that staff, parents, the learners themselves could look at their child and they could say, in terms of engaging with their learning, this is the emerging characteristics, the developing characteristics, the established characteristics, which would probably be what you are aiming for. So this column here would probably be, that's the goal we're aiming for, but it's still demonstrated that that wasn't an end in itself. There's still further they could go. So the enhanced characteristics. So the intention was to describe what you would be able to observe either about yourself as a learner, or staff could observe about learners and be able to say, he's definitely listening much more intently during lessons now, and he's asking some questions that are relevant rather than questions that have got nothing to do with the subject matter. And there's hints of enthusiasm coming out. So actually we might be able to highlight that as being, that's where he is at the moment in terms of engagement, and then think about other areas as well, responsibility and independence. And we used this table as a way of almost saying to the learners, you highlight where you think you are on here, and yes, there is an issue to do with language, and is the language suitable for the learner to understand? But assuming that they have a quite high level of use of language, which I know isn't necessarily true for everybody, but in terms of the principle of it, I could highlight each of these for a learner. They might highlight a different place for themselves as learners. They might think they're quite established in terms of engagement. I think they might just be developing. And we have a discussion about why I think they are developing and they think they are established. So that conversation is a real learning conversation about understanding, a shared understanding about exactly what that child means about their learning and how they see themselves. So I felt this had got a lot of potential for people being able to articulate where they thought they were and where others might think they were, and that could generate a discussion and an argument. So I've had this model for about 18 years. That's how long ago I used it. And when I came to work at university, I used that, I got that idea and I shared it with some colleagues. And when I was asked to start lecturing and looking at learning from an adult learning point of view, and I was introduced to the concept of andragogy as opposed to pedagogy, and I started to look at the Malcolm Knowles model of what differentiates adult learning from children's learning, I came across a similar model to the model of Hargreaves, in that here's characteristics, Knowles characteristics, not the same characteristics as in the David Hargreaves model, but it was a similar idea of talking about okay, an adult learner has self-concept. They mature from being dependent, what it says here, from being a dependent personality towards being a self-directed human being. Now, it doesn't define self-directed, but it uses the terminology. The thing that I questioned in Knoll's model, as with the Hargreaves model, is they don't go from nothing to having no self-concept to having a complete self-concept. They must surely gradually get a stronger self-concept as they go through life, or as they learn more about themselves. So again, I developed this model to suggest, what would it look like if your self-concept is just emerging? If you start to develop your self-concept quite well, or establish your self-concept, how would that change over time? And that was a model that I'd worked with, and it's incomplete, and I've always left it incomplete, because this is where I got to with my students, because I wanted to do it with them. I didn't want to do it to them. And there were a group of adults who were more mature students. They were on an undergraduate program, but a number of them were quite mature and were doing their degree a little bit later in life. And it was just really interesting to engage with them in this discussion. So we came up with this together with their help. But the principle is the same of this. What does it look like? And following the conversation that we had, it suddenly made me think, is there a connection? There may not be, but is there a connection of taking this model of andragogy as a developing a maturity model? And would it be appropriate to attach the selves to these stages? So in other words, is a self-managing person have a lower level of self-concept than a self-organized or a self-directed person? Is that true, or does that not actually describe it? And for me, it just started a process of thinking, I feel now that I think I might be able to articulate what in my head separates somebody who is self-managing their learning as compared to somebody who is actually self-directing their learning. And I have to admit that I've assumed, without looking at it carefully enough, that self-determinant theory is probably the higher level, mainly because it's attached to, I understand it's attached to heutagogy, which it seems to be at a different level than andragogy. So I've tended to put that as being in that, as being a higher self than, say, self-managing. But that's the point I've got to. And so the point is, it's really just me trying to articulate, what do each of these selves look like in terms of the Knoll's model of andragogy. I would challenge Knoll's, if I could, to say, I don't think it just applies to adults. I think this is something that could apply to learners of all ages if we just change the language a little bit. And my previous maturity model table would be a sort of suggestion towards that. But this is where I am at the moment with this table, this idea, and thinking about, is this a way of trying to define self-managing and differentiate between them? So you asked the question, Sisko. So if this was appropriate, where would self-regulated sit within this? And maybe that's something that I could try and use this table as a means of arguing a case for where I would put self-regulated learning. So that's where I've got to at the moment. When I've used this in any kind of paper or discussion or presentation anywhere, I've always left it as it is. I've used it to demonstrate students collaborating over what their learning might look like. I haven't had this conversation about trying to use this as a means of relating it to the selves, and I would be really interested to sort of see whether there's value in doing that, and if so, how might this change